A broken neck and spinal injuries suffered on the way to a police station. A year on from Freddie Gray's death in police custody, we're looking at what lessons have been learned. Also on today's program, is this the beginning of the end for Dilma Rousseff? The Brazilian president vows to keep fighting after Congress votes to impeach her. And in Picture This, Houston is declared a disaster zone after record rainfall brings the largest floods for 15 years. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. A year ago in Baltimore, an African-American man was arrested by police after running away from them. His name was Freddie Gray and he was 25 years old. A week later, he was dead, having suffered fatal injuries on his way to central booking. His death, one of a number of deaths of unarmed black males at the hands of the police, prompted weeks of sometimes violent protests in Baltimore and across the country. 6 officers were charged over his death, but only one so far has gone on trial. And on the anniversary of his death, people are going back on the streets to demand action. Today's newsmaker then is Freddie Gray, as we ask what, if anything, has changed in the past 12 months.
One year ago, a 25-year-old Baltimore man died in hospital. How he got there began a week earlier. That day was like many others outside the Gilmore Homes project, another arrest in a high-crime area. But this time, things turned out different. The man police arrested was Freddie Gray, and 30 minutes later, he was in a coma. A week later, he was dead. All of it happened while police were under intense scrutiny. It was at the height of the civil rights movement Black Lives Matter. According to police, it happened this way. They spotted Gray walking down the street, and when he saw them, he ran. They caught and searched him and found an illegal knife. He resisted arrest, but the officers managed to put him in the back of a police van. Inside, he threw himself against the walls and caused his own injuries, which later proved fatal. But this is what the state says.
The findings of our comprehensive, thorough, and independent investigation, coupled with the medical examiner's determination that Mr. Gray's death was a homicide, which we received today, has led us to believe that we have probable cause to file criminal charges.
According to the medical examiner, Gray died from a spinal injury caused when he slammed into the back of the police transport van. 5 of the 6 officers involved are still facing trial.
Black lives matter because you're killing black people.
Gray's death came almost 2 years after the launch of the Black Lives Matter movement.
It is absolutely vital that the truth comes out on what happened to Mr. Freddie Gray.
The movement began after the acquittal of Neighborhood Watch coordinator George Zimmerman, who shot dead unarmed black teenager Trayvon Martin in Florida in 2012, and also followed the deaths of several other black men and the acquittal of those involved. It turned what had been a community debate into a national one. Many minority groups said the public needed to be more aware of what had happened.
Let's don't kid ourselves. We wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for video cameras. Instead of one cover-up behind that blue wall, after another cover-up behind that blue wall, and one lie after another lie, now we see the truth.
But although politicians promised change, was there any?
We're here because we feel threatened. All of our sons are at risk. The number's not been called on yet. There's too much killing, too much hatred, too much violence, too much fear.
Soraya Lenny, the Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now to discuss the impact of America's Black Lives Matter movement is Christopher Harris, Executive Director of Unhyphenated America. And he's joining us from Washington, D.C. Christopher, good to have you on the show again. You don't believe that Black Lives Matter as a movement has any relevance or legitimacy, do you?
Good evening, Imran. No, I think it's actually a counterproductive movement. What they should be promoting, if I was going to talk to them from an advertising standpoint, I would say, you should be promoting that all lives matter. The same things that worked in the 1960s rather, when you had black men who were trying to promote the idea that I am the same as you. The only thing that's different between you and I is the color of my skin. And so I'm a man just like you are. That's what they promoted. I'm a man. And so you're not going to win anything. You're not going to win any hearts and minds by telling people Black Lives Matter, especially when somebody can easily look and say, well, the homicide rates within the black community are off the charts. And so people can easily say, well, if Black Lives Matter, maybe you should start in the home.
Let's look at patterns for a moment. The movement spurred by the deaths of unarmed black men, usually at the hands of cops. With Zimmerman, it was a little bit different, but let's look at it. You've got Freddie Gray, you've got Mike Brown in Ferguson, unarmed, Eric Garner and the chokehold. You've got Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, who was a kid, unarmed. For many, this is a pattern. Usually young black men killed by usually white people in positions of authority. They prefer to see it as a pattern. You prefer to see this as just isolated, random incidents that have nothing to do with each other?
Well, Imran, if you look at the grand scheme of things, I believe in bringing a broader perspective. If you look at the number of deaths in the black community from homicides, I mean, between the time of a Freddie Gray and a Mike Brown, there were easily 1,000 young black males who died at the hands of other black males. And nobody knows their names. That's what, listen, the death of Tamir Rice, that's a tragedy, okay? The death of these individuals, all of these lives matter. This is what we should be promoting. All these lives matter, but the majority of things that we can control ourselves within our own communities. And I'd like to point out a great story that, people want to talk about what's the aftermath of Freddie Gray. The great story is Miss Toya Graham and her son, Michael Singleton. That's the great story. That's somebody who decided, hey, I don't want this for my son. And she took control of her son. You might not know the name off the top of your head.
Sure, no,
but
she gave him a couple slaps. No, we do know, of course. No, she gave him a couple slaps and he was protesting and she pulled him out of the protest. Yes. Granted, I want to ask you again, you say all lives matter. From the perspective of the cops, can you honestly say that across the country, according to the vast majority of policemen in the country, to them, all lives matter?
Well, here's one thing you might not know about me. I'm the son of a career law enforcement officer. My father was a special agent in the Air Force for 25 years, or just over 20 years, almost 25 years. And then he served another 12 years as a deputy sheriff. I've done ride-alongs with other police officers who were also black, and so yes, they will tell you those lives do matter. But also cops want to go home at night. I can tell you, I always wanted my father to come home safely at night. And when you do a ride-along, you see the sort of things that police officers see. So do Black lives matter? Well, police officers, to them, all lives matter, that they will go out of their way to save your life. They'll put their life in danger to save your life. So are these incidents tragic? Of course they're tragic. No one wants to see that.
Why is it then, Christopher? Sorry to interrupt you. Yes, it is tragic. Why is it then in the aftermath of Ferguson, when you had the Justice Department investigation into Ferguson PD, Eric Holder's Justice Department looked into it. They investigated for a year, and they found that the police department responsible for the death of Mike Brown, even though Darren Wilson was let off, they found them unconstitutional, and they found them racist. These are the Justice Department's words, not mine. They found the police department racist. Does that not help you understand the context in which unarmed black men end up dead at the hands of white cops?
Imran, let's be honest here. Racism has become ketchup. You can put it on everything. And I think it's interesting, we're talking about like Baltimore, for example. You had Ben Shapiro did a panel a couple of months ago, and he was addressing some of the people, and it was about the same issue of the problems in Baltimore. And what he pointed out to them, because he was saying, hey, here's all this information, here's all the statistics, and they said, well, somebody said, well, there has to be racism. And that is the mindset that they've adopted. Yeah. And the Eric Holder-led Justice Department, I just... So that's what their whole thing is.
But you don't recognize
everything as
the
racism.
validity of their investigation then, from the Justice Department?
No, not at all. Because, I mean, they went through a year, and you know, with all the high-profile information they had, Imran, is that they came up with nothing solid other than to say, well, we do think there is some racism.
No, there were pedestrian checks of black people, and usually it was a money-making scheme because they do these pedestrian checks and traffic fines. They'd make money, they'd write about it in their emails, they had racist emails amongst each other. And these are the people, these are the cops who are tasked with looking after a majority black community or protecting a majority black community. But let's move on for a second. Let's mention Baltimore. Baltimore has a black mayor, a black attorney general, Marilyn Mosby. 3 of the 6 cops charged after Freddie Gray died were black. Now, usually with that information, the question is, where's the structural racism and the underrepresentation? But I wonder, maybe the real question is, would those cops have been charged at all if this wasn't the case? I.e., did Baltimore need to have so many African Americans in these positions of power for us to get to where we are right now, to talking about this? Would it have just been another let-off after the death of Freddie Gray if Baltimore had the demographics of every other city in the country?
Well, you know, the interesting thing is these issues don't happen in bulk in other areas where they're not controlled. Let's be honest, Baltimore, Detroit, New Orleans, all these places that have black Democrat-head governments, they have the most problems. I personally don't live in those areas, and I don't have the problems that black people complain about experiencing all the time. You know, my family lives in Colorado. Guess what? They don't complain about those problems in Colorado.
So what are the root causes?
You get pulled over. I've been pulled over for these. But here's the thing, Imran. You're talking about these issues. See, I've been pulled over for speeding in Virginia. I've been pulled over for speeding in Colorado. And you know what? I got let off with basically a virtual slap on my hand.
Let me
Nobody
then ask
jacked me out of my car, none of that.
Let me ask you, Christopher, what are the root causes then? You don't believe that the root causes are structural racism or trigger-happy racist cops. We're seeing the killing of young black men. We learn a new name every few months. What are the root causes, according to Christopher Harris?
You learn a new name, but the thing is that there's, for every new name that you learn, Imran, there are hundreds who were killed by other black people that you never hear about. And the reason is the hundreds that were killed by other black people are not leverage points that can be used. They don't make good news. It's good news to talk about, oh, one black person was shot by a cop, and oh, wait a minute, the person happened to be a white cop. That's even better.
So let's take that further back then. Okay, fair enough. Let's take this further back then. What are the root causes of the hundreds of black people being killed by other black people and the poverty and the dire situation we find these communities in? What are those root causes then?
A lot of that goes back to as Toya Graham. Let's reference Toya Graham, the mother of Michael Singleton. You know, she's a single mother. I think she has 4 or 5 kids. But one of the things that she talked about was, yes, it's a struggle financially to provide for 4 or 5 kids. But she tried to make sure that she was on top of her son and tried to keep him out of trouble. I wrote an article about it. You can see Michael Singleton was well on his way to a life of crime. But because of the love of a mother, active parenting, and her being involved and saying, no, I'm not going to allow you to do this. And Michael Singleton himself said, I knew I was doing wrong. I knew when I saw my mother that she was going to come after me. Everybody in the neighborhood knew that. Active parenting makes a difference. And you can run the statistics and say, hey, listen, single parent households are the biggest problem that black people face. It's not systemic racism. Is there racism out there? Of course there's racism out there. Only a fool would say that there's not racism out there. But is it systemic, as if everyone's out to get you? No, there's a lot of things, because if you say that's true, then what you're doing is you're also invalidating my personal experience or the personal experiences of a lot of the people that I associate with. You have to ask, why is it that when I have the same skin that they have, why do I have a different experience? Maybe it's because I think differently, Imran, and I behave differently.
Christopher Harris, Thank you very much for joining us. Still to come on the Newsmakers, we're asking if Brazil's president can hold on to power after Congress votes to impeach her. And in Picture This, hundreds are rescued as floods hit Houston. Brazil's Congress has voted to impeach President Dilma Rousseff over allegations she manipulated state funds ahead of the last elections. It's an embarrassing blow for the former left-wing guerrilla fighter who had promised to combat corruption during her campaign. She's pledged to fight the allegations, which she calls tantamount to a coup. The Newsmakers' Randolph Nogel reports.
A political storm has erupted. Public anger is seething, and the future of Latin America's largest country and economy hangs in the balance. Brazil's president, Dilma Rousseff, is fighting for her political life.
Unlike what some are saying, the end has not begun. We're at the beginning of the battle, a long, slow battle.
And the outcome may determine the fate of her left-wing Workers' Party, which has been in power since 2002. But is the contempt for her and the hope for her downfall solely about the allegations she faces, or a public indictment of the political system itself? It appears Brazilians' tolerance for politicians on the take may be coming to an end. On paper, Dilma Rousseff faces impeachment for an alleged cover-up. She's accused of hiding the scope of the government's deficit during her re-election campaign 2 years ago. But protesters have focused their anger on the wide-ranging embezzlement scandal involving the state oil company Petrobras. Rousseff was the chairwoman of Petrobras during the years the corruption took place, but she hasn't been directly linked to the scandal. The scheme implicated almost all of Brazil's major political parties and exposed the scale of the country's corruption problem. The commission to impeach Rousseff has 65 members. More than half of them, 37 in all, face charges of corruption or other serious crimes. 303 of 515 members of Brazil's lower house of Congress are in a similar situation, as are 49 of 81 Brazilian senators. The irony of Rousseff's political opponents prosecuting her on charges similar to the ones they face is not lost on voters. Many want the architect of her political demolition, Eduardo Cunha, gone as well. He's been indicted on Petrobras-related charges. But the public's censure of Rousseff is not just about corruption, but also the failure of her ruling Workers' Party to lift Brazil out of a deepening recession. When Rousseff was elected in 2011, she was one of the most popular leaders in the world. 92% of Brazilians supported her then. 61% want to see her go now. In the interim, economic growth has reversed. Brazil's economy contracted by 3.5% last year. Unemployment is at 10%, with youth unemployment double that figure. And last year, Brazil's currency fell as much as 30% against the dollar. For those who see Rousseff's political rivals as equally corrupt, the pretext of a faltering economy is surely enough reason to back her impeachment. The outrage being seen on the streets is the manifestation of a perennial fault line in Brazilian politics: inequality. President Dilma Rousseff's survival may ultimately not be determined by the allegations she faces, but by the economic tide. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Austin, Texas, to discuss whether Brazil can recover from yet another corruption scandal is Reggie Thompson. He's a Latin America analyst at Stratfor. Thanks for joining us again, Reggie. These numbers are fascinating. The lower house, 367 votes to 137. That's resounding in terms of that vote for her impeachment. But then again, these guys are not squeaky clean, are they? They're pots and kettles and glass houses everywhere. 37 of the 65 on the impeachment commission face charges of corruption and other serious crimes. What is going on in Brazil? Are they all corrupt?
So it's notable that very many of the members of the impeachment commission and many of the congressional members that have been pushing for Dilma Rousseff's impeachment over the past year really have been involved in some sort of corruption or another. There's individuals like Michel Temer, the vice president, who could potentially succeed Dilma Rousseff if the impeachment process goes through the Senate. He is accused of receiving illegal funds from some of the construction firms involved in the Petrobras scandal and of taking kickbacks. And this is really a process that could really come back to harm him later on in the form of an electoral court ruling expected later this year or early next year. But there are other individuals such as Eduardo Cunha, the president of the lower house, also allegedly involved in these corruption scandals. So really, you've got a situation where these opposition parties, after more than a decade of Workers' Party rule, sensed a weakness with Dilma Rousseff due to the faltering economy and also due to her party's involvement in this corruption scandal. Really, they sensed that Dilma was really getting a black eye from this political scandal, and they moved against her. Now, legally, there is a rationale for carrying on with her impeachment. After all, a court ruling last year ruled that the fiscal irregularities committed by the government of Dilma Rousseff in previous years were criminal in nature. However, there is the perception in Brazil and abroad among other Latin American states that this is really an opportunistic political move taken by other parties, sensing a weakness on the part of the Workers' Party.
Let's take stock of the Workers' Party for a moment. As you mentioned, they've been in power for over a decade, came to power in 2003. Can we say that they did a great job for a period of time and then presided over a weakening economy and succumbed to the temptation of corruption?
So it's notable, it really depends on who you ask, because for many ordinary Brazilians, obviously, some of the social programs enacted during the first Workers' Party administration, the one under Luis Inácio da Silva, that was, the expansion of the social programs really was beneficial for many poorer Brazilians. Now, really, it's a situation of being in the right place at the right time for corruption as far as a lot of the ruling Workers' Party officials were concerned, simply because Brazil was experiencing the greatest oil windfall really in its history at this point, and there were a lot of Brazilian, both public and private sector officials with plenty of opportunities for corruption, and they took those opportunities.
Final question for you. You mentioned this isn't like other Latin American countries. I wonder, in a corruption sense, how does Brazil compare to its neighbors?
So really, that's a tricky question to some level, because a lot of corruption obviously goes unnoticed, unreported, because of in the interest of the people that are carrying it out. Obviously, it's not in their interest to bring it to public light. But I mean, Brazil, what the scandal showed us is that Brazil was deeply affected by corruption at many levels of government. Compared to other countries, Brazil has been better about, in recent past, since the Petrobras scandal has been uncovered, it has been better at prosecuting the major cases of corruption than other countries. For example, just to compare it regionally to Mexico, many corruption scandals have popped up, not to the level of the Petrobras scandal, but they haven't really been prosecuted with the same vigor as the prosecutors in Brazil. Venezuela is another example. There have been many incentives in national economic policy really incentivizing corruption at higher levels, and nothing has really come of it. So Brazil, just by default, really by the way they have carried out the Lava Jato investigation, they have been doing a much better job than their neighbors of combating corruption.
Reggie, always good to get your analysis. Reggie Thompson joining us there. Thanks. In today's Picture This, the governor of Texas has declared a state of disaster in 9 counties after severe flooding submerged parts of the southern U.S. state. Let's take a look. Today's newsmaker has been Freddie Gray, as we asked if anything's changed in the year since his death. 6 police officers still await trial over the circumstances of his death, but questions still remain. Why was he left unrestrained in the back of a police van for half an hour? And why did it take so long for him to receive medical assistance? These are all questions a prosecution will ask when these cases come to trial. But more crucially, how can these sorts of incidents be prevented from happening again? US police killed over 1,000 people last year, and there's a large and growing backlash against this kind of violence. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. As always, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.